Yu-Gi-Oh! Duelist of the Roses, one of the many licensed Yu-Gi-Oh! Games to be released throughout the early 2000s. I swear to God, just about everyone had a copy of this game growing up. While there were plenty of Yu-Gi-Oh! Games developed and released across multiple consoles, few saw the financial success of Duelist of the Roses, as the game would go on to sell around 1.37 million copies in the United States and Europe. Between 2001 and 2006, it would be ranked as the 60th highest selling game across all three major platforms for the time. This card battle simulator at one point was one of the most played games of all time. But when playing it today, one must wonder exactly why. So, Duelist of the Roses was developed and published by Konami between 2001 and 2003 when the franchise was first being introduced to the United States and other parts of the world. Many kids like me ate, breathed, and slept Yu-Gi-Oh! When we weren't playing the physical card game, we were watching the TV series on Kids WB or Cartoon Network. Back then, it was easy to get sucked into anything Yu-Gi-Oh! Related. And Duelist of the Roses was just one of those games which drew interest due to the fact that it had the Yu-Gi-Oh! Name on it. Yu-Gi-Oh! Duelist of the Roses probably had one of, if not one of the most idiotic settings and stories. For some reason, the game's story is loosely based on the War of the Roses. If you're not familiar with this war, well, here's a little history lesson for you. This war occurred in England between 1455 and 1487 between the competing houses of the Plantagenet dynasty that ruled England since the 12th century. The war is often labeled by historians as the War Between Cousins, as it had the sons and descendants of the late 14th century King Edward III competing for the English throne. One side represented the red rose of the Lancastrians, and the other side represented the white rose of the Yorkists. This war might sound fancy given the name, but make no mistake, this was one of the most violent periods in English history, as it resulted in thousands of deaths and political instability for years to come. It would end with the death of Richard III in 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth Field. It was here where the army of Henry Tudor prevailed over the Yorkists, led by Richard III, King of England at the time, who was then killed at Bosworth Field. Of course, the game doesn't explain any of this. All you need to know is that you're a rose duelist who has been summoned from the present time back to 1485. You first meet Simon McMoran. McMoran, is that really his name? McMoran is a druid of the Lancastrian forces. He briefs you on the situation against the Yorkists. He explains that the only way to defeat the Yorkist house is to collect 8 rose cards from the Yorkist side. This exchange takes forever to get through, as not only does McMoran explain what's going on in England, but he also explains the new rules of the game. Then out of nowhere, Seto Kaiba appears. Only wait, he's not Kaiba, he's actually Christian Rosencrantz. The dialogue goes on, and eventually you must select a side to play for. And unfortunately, there is no way to skip this, you just have to bear it. And with this exchange, you also pick the deck you plan on using. This selection is limited to around 4 choices. 4 horrible choices anyway. So, gameplay. Don't expect the traditional format of Yu-Gi-Oh! Here. No, Duelist of the Roses follows the golden rule, or I like to call the piss rule. In each duel, players compete on a 7x7 table with each player commanding a deck leader which acts as a representation of their life points. Players can play and set one card at a time and move the card across the field. As the battle takes place, players will reveal their cards and battle with their respective monsters on the field. The monster with the highest attack will naturally prevail, and monsters who fight each other with the same attack power will destroy each other. In this game, the major object, like other board games, is to gain control of the board, or in this case, the field. Each 7x7 board you play on will have a certain number of terrains that players have to pay special attention to. Depending on the monster type and attribute of the monster, that said monster will gain a field power bonus in the form of 500 extra attack and defense. At the same time, a monster can lose attack and defense power by being on the wrong terrain. In some cases, terrains could act as barriers that prevent the player from moving cards in a certain area. Throughout each turn, players can move each card they have on the field just once. If the terrain is suitable, you can move your card around 2 to 3 spaces if they are face up. While monster battles can help you win, remember the main objective is to control the board and take up as much of the opponent's space as possible. Eventually, you'll want to get in a position where you can trap the opponent's deck master and attack them directly. Duels of the Roses is a pretty easy game to learn, and anyone who is familiar with the physical card game will not have a hard time learning the rules here. Unfortunately, this format is plagued by several issues. For one, it's pretty challenging to actually build a suitable deck. You are very much limited to using the weakest cards, at least at first anyway. Remember those decks you looked through earlier? Well, these decks mostly consist of weak monsters with attack power mostly under 1500. And depending on the DP or deck power of your deck, your selection of powerful monsters is limited even if you did have them. You see, each card in your deck has a certain deck cost, which is a value given to a card based on its strength. And that brings up the next issue of the game, the deck costs. The higher the attack power, the more the deck cost is. Sure, over time you can improve your deck costs and get better cards through the annoying slot machine, but here's the thing. Each opponent you battle will typically have a deck with relatively strong monsters and high deck costs. This makes the game at the beginning extremely difficult, which in turn means that you have to grind excessively to even stand half a chance against tougher opponents. After you win a duel, you gain one rose card from the opposite side, and you get a chance to get one of their cards from the graveyard slot machine. Too bad they just can't give you an awesome card for winning the duel. No, you must put up with the annoying slot machine for a chance of getting a good card. But more than likely, you won't get anything useful. Now, Yu-Gi-Oh games have come a long way since the early 2000s, and obviously, if you want your Yu-Gi-Oh fix today, there are a ton of other much better games to play. But does that make Yu-Gi-Oh! Duels of the Roses unplayable? I don't think so. Duels of the Roses might have its problems, but some can still find enjoyment in playing it. If you get past the frustrating process of building a suitable deck, you can appreciate the fun this card-based simulator has to offer. Although the game is easy to learn, it's hard to master. The sheer challenge of building your deck can be frustrating, but when you create a suitable deck, it's rewarding. The challenge of Duels of the Roses lies in the limited amount of magic and trap cards available. While the game does offer magic and traps, they use up a fair amount of deck costs, so you'll have to limit your selection to just a few. It's annoying, but it makes sense since the grand scheme of the game is to drain your opponent's life points, and you can only do that by gaining control of the field and getting your monsters in a position to attack your opponent. And you can't necessarily do that with magic or trap cards. They can only be used to help you gain control of the field. So in turn, this makes you more reliant on your monsters and your decisions in placing them on the field. And while you're limited to the number of powerful monsters you can control or have in your deck, that doesn't mean you just can't create them yourself. Most Yu-Gi-Oh fans are familiar with the process of polymerization, where you take two monsters and combine them to make one more powerful monster. In the metagame, you typically do this with a polymerization card. However, in Duels of the Roses, you can combine various weak monsters to make a more powerful monster without the use of a magic card. You can combine these cards to form powerful monsters by just joining together two cards that might form a certain monster. You have to be a little creative here and consider the monster type. Let's say I wanted to make a Pumpkin King, a powerful zombie monster with a good effect and good attack. Well, essentially, Pumpkin King is a zombie plant, right? So combine one zombie with one plant monster and you get a Pumpkin King. With a Pumpkin King, I was able to strengthen all my zombie type monsters and really stick it to Weevil Underwood. There are plenty of other different fusion combinations that can be used to summon powerful monsters. And keep in mind that these same monsters who have weak attack power will also have a low deck cost. And the old school Yu-Gi-Oh fan will appreciate the amount of work in crafting the wonderfully rendered terrains. It's quite reminiscent of the first season of Yu-Gi-Oh! The TV series, where the duelists had to pay special attention to the terrain that they were on. And this in turn would usually combine with the duelist style or personality. And to me, the designers did a good job here in incorporating that factor into the format of the game, thus making the Field Magic card take a new major role of importance. By using these cards, you can change up the terrain to your advantage and to your opponent's disadvantage. Perhaps the best detail about Duels of the Roses is the fact that it was the first Yu-Gi-Oh game to offer real-time battle simulations of monsters. Now sure, these scenes can get a little tiring, But back in the early 2000s, this blew me and my friends away. It was almost like we were reenacting scenes from the show, and the CG rendered monsters looked pretty good and detailed overall. Honestly, the game, while dull at times, makes up for it with a remarkable presentation and of course, music. At the end of the day, this game will only be enjoyable by a small number of old school Yu-Gi-Oh fans. Like I said earlier, you can find plenty of other better Yu-Gi-Oh licensed games across various consoles nowadays. With that said, it's pretty easy to overlook Duelist of the Roses. One must wonder exactly why this game sold as well as it did when it came to the US in 2003. I think there's a few reasonable explanations to this. You see, the actual card game, Yu-Gi-Oh, while existing in Japan since 1999, was slowly being introduced to the United States and Europe around the early 2000s. And on top of that, the TV show, originally debuting in 2000, had come to the United States in 2001. By 2004, Yu-Gi-Oh was still relatively new, and being that Duels of the Roses was the first Yu-Gi-Oh game to be featured on modern consoles, it was only natural that fanboys like me would want a copy. Now, you would think that fanboys would have despised the actual format of the game. However, we have to consider that this particular video game was made at a time when the card game rules were still being hashed out. While the TV show would come to the US in 2001, the actual card game itself wouldn't be introduced until 2002, meaning that no one, not even the developers of the game, were aware of the official rules that would be established for the game itself. And now that I'm thinking about it, Season 1 of Yu-Gi-Oh! Did not have the same rules that we are familiar with. Just like Season 1 of Yu-Gi-Oh!, Duelist of the Roses offered a alternative format to playing the trading card game. So it's really no wonder that this particular game was so different than what was seen before, or after. If you truly want to stroll down memory lane, I would definitely recommend that you play Yu-Gi-Oh! Duelist of the Roses. Here's the thing though, don't buy this on console as the game is way too expensive. Instead, I would tell you to just load it up on an emulator, as the game is still pretty fun to play today. Well, that concludes this retrospective video. Thank you guys for watching and supporting the channel. If you like this video, well, make sure you leave a like, and if you haven't, make sure you subscribe to Smoking Fiend Productions. This is Bob of Smoking Fiend Productions signing off.